We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Yo guys! I'm Yuruzi. Here's part 12 of What If Naruto Studied Fuinjutsu. While exploring the Team 7 training ground, a young Naruto happens to stumble across a strangely shaped kunai embedded in a tree. Years of frustration and deciphering later, he finally cracks the Fuinjutsu formula hidden along the handle to surprising and painful results. At the same time, a ghost of the Otsutsuki sets in motion a plan to end his family's eternal conflict. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 47, The Finals, Part 3. Despite the somber tone that had seemed to settle over the stadium from the brutal end of the previous match, the crowd seemed to find its second wind as it started to notice the next two competitors heading down to the field. Chatter and cheers erupted from the crowd as the last loyal Uchiha made his way towards the center of the arena. Ria raised an eyebrow as she glanced across the stadium, taking in the overwhelming support for the sourpuss. Of course, her brother was right along with them, shouting his head off as he recognized the dark-haired boy. "Hey! There he is! There he is!" Tai excitedly chanted as he tugged on her sleeve. "Go Sasuke!" he shouted, throwing his hands in the air. Ria stifled a chuckle as she watched her younger brother's eyes gleam in admiration over his newfound idol. Ever since Sasuke had graciously offered them his tickets, he was all Tai would ask her about. When was the last time she talked to him? What kind of missions did he go on? Every day brought a new round of interrogations. It seemed that despite her best efforts, the boy simply had shinobi on the brain. However, he was never going to walk down that path. Not if she had anything to say about it. Although, it still hurt her to have to shut him down every time he asked. At least letting him come today would ease her conscience. Ria glanced back down at the field and quietly stared at the somber boy she had gotten to know over the last few weeks. "Alright, duck butt. Let's see what's so damn special about you." Sasuke tried his best to hold back a smirk as he stared across the field toward his opponent. Finally, it was his turn for some action. Shino stood as silent as usual, as if he was barely interested in the situation they were in. "Alright, we're ready to get underway. You two ready to go?" Genma asked. "A moment, please," Shino declared before turning to Sasuke. "Something you want to say?" Sasuke asked. "More of a request," Shino replied, slightly catching Sasuke off guard. He pushed up his glasses and continued, "It doesn't take a genius to determine the probable outcome of this match. On top of your aptitude for Katan Jutsu, I find it hard to envision myself overcoming your prowess in Taijutsu." Sasuke raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning to forfeit?" "Not at all," Shino replied with a shake of his head. "I simply wish to ask you to refrain from holding back." Shino tilted his head and gazed up towards the stands. He gazed straight through the glass at the judges, who stared straight back at them. "This match isn't about winning or losing. It is about demonstrating to them that we have the capacity to bear the responsibility that being a Chunin requires. Even if I lose, if my performance is satisfactory, I may still earn a promotion." Sasuke nodded his head, but was still slightly confused. "And what does that have to do with me going all out?" Shino almost seemed to smile. "Let's just say, I wish to know where I rank among my peers." Sasuke chuckled as he rested his palm on the handle of his sword. "Certainly. I'll give you the match you want, but regarding your promotion, that all depends on you, doesn't it?" He smirked as his eyes flashed red. "Yes. I suppose it does," Shino nodded, as he grew silent once again. "Alright, if you two are finished," Genma called out before raising his arm. "Ready? Begin." There was a whistle of grinding metal as Sasuke's sword cleared its scabbard. He disappeared in a blur, racing across the arena. He blazed past Shino, who remained motionless, before his torso lifted off from the clean slice through his chest. The audience gasped in shock as the Aburame boy was cut clean in half, only to draw back in disgust as the body dissolved into a shower of insects. The swarm quickly recovered and began hurtling towards Sasuke. Before the bug clone had even fallen apart, Sasuke had been already leaping away, and reaching into his bag. As he flipped away, his eyes soaked in every detail of the cloud of insects racing towards him. His Sharingan soaked in every nook and crevice of their shells, their twitching antennae, and their black, emotionless eyes. He quickly sheathed his sword, before throwing a small scroll towards the ground. He raced through the two-hand signs and forcefully stomped on the dark seal in the center. The ink glowed once before water began flooding from the paper. The water shot out like a geyser, and began spreading all across the field. The Kikaichu along the ground were washed back by the violent torrent, but the swarm still in the air continued to soar towards him. Before the water had even reached the Kikaichu in the grass, Sasuke had already started racing through hand signs. He cupped his mouth and began firing off one phoenix fire jutsu after another. A loud whine and multiple screeches echoed off the arena walls, as explosions rocked the cloud of insects. Tiny, burnt bodies littered down from the sky as the swarm was quickly burnt to a crisp. Sasuke fired off his last fireball, and reached into his bag. He quickly launched 3 shuriken in a wide arc. They twisted as they soared and began to curve towards one of the trees that littered the sides of the arena. They flew towards the tree, forcing Shino to jump away as they flew through the spot where he had been hiding. His shoulders were slumped and he seemed to be glaring through his round glasses. "He's getting agitated," Sasuke thought as he watched the remnants of the swarm flee back towards Shino. "Sorry about your hive, but you're going to have to do better than that," he called out as he gripped the handle of his sword. "Indeed," Shino replied in an even tone, as he resumed his trademark stance. Sasuke prepared to race towards him again, but stopped as Shino began launching a volley of kunai. As they raced towards him, his sharp eyes caught sight of the paper tags attached to the kunai at the handle. Sasuke ground to a halt, and leapt to the side as the explosions rocked the arena. Shino didn't let up the pressure, and continued to toss kunai after the Uchiha. With his eyes, Sasuke was easily able to predict their trajectory and dodged accordingly. He began making his way towards the wall, and began racing along its circular edge, drawing closer to his opponent. Shino finally relented his barrage and thrust out his arm. A wild cloud of Kikaichu launched from his sleeve and raced towards Sasuke. Sasuke slid to a stop and quickly vaulted straight towards the incoming wave. He raced through the necessary hand seals and fired off a large fireball straight through the heart of the swarm. The fire tore through the Kikaichu, leaving a massive hole in its wake. Sasuke dove through this hole, and landed right in front of Shino, much to his surprise. Shino attempted to jump back, but he felt his breath hitch as he lost his footing. He cursed as he tried his best to find solid footing on top of the mud. Already thinking 2 steps ahead, he thought to himself as he watched Sasuke recover from his fall and race towards him. He's already preparing the field for his match with Gaara. By covering the field in water and mud, it shall be difficult for him to control and create more sand. He braced himself as he was forced to take a stinging kick from Sasuke, which sent him sliding across the mud. He quickly withdrew a kunai as he spied the raven-haired boy jogging towards him with his sword already drawn. Shino grunted as tiny cuts began coating his body. Taijutsu had never really been his strong suit, and he was absolutely being overwhelmed. He tried his best to parry the many strokes from Sasuke's blade, but more than a fair share were making their way through his defense. Sasuke smirked, as he got ready to stab the tip of his blade through the loop of Shino's kunai. All it would take was a swift twist and he would be disarmed. As he prepared to deliver his stroke, he paused as his Sharingan caught sight of Shino's head. Shino seemed to not really be looking at him, rather over his shoulder. His eyes widened and he quickly cut off his attack. He leapt over the boy and kicked him forward, straight into the small swarm that had been creeping up behind him. Shino quickly recovered and released more Kikaichu from his jacket. The 2 swarms melded together and contorted into the shape of a massive fist. He swung the massive form, but Sasuke was easily able to leap away. Ignoring the mud coating his hands, Sasuke flipped away, over and over, until, in the middle of one arc, he threw his sword into the ground. He landed on the handle, keeping himself balanced atop his palm. He smirked towards Shino as he began racing through one-handed seals. Shino's eyebrows shot up in panic as he watched electricity spark down the blade and connect with the layer of water that covered the field. Shino cried out in pain as electricity raced through his body. As if on cue, the massive swarm fell apart and dropped to the ground. That ought to have given his queen a shock. Sasuke smirked as he cut off the jutsu. Shino slunk to his knees as he desperately attempted to catch his breath. Every inch of his skin stung, and his mind faintly registered the stench of burning skin. His opponent refused to give him any reprieve as he raced towards him one last time. Sasuke curled his fingers into claws as he began spreading chakra all across his body. Shino's eyes lit up in recognition as he desperately tried to stand up. Suga! Sasuke cried as he twisted and began twirling in a fierce tornado. Kiba's mouth hung open in shock, as he watched Sasuke plow into his teammate, sending him flying into the arena wall. Sasuke decelerated from his spin, sliding along the mud as he caught sight of Shino among the debris. Shino coughed as he attempted to push himself out of the rubble. He froze as he felt a thin but forceful pressure against his neck. He gazed over his glasses at Sasuke, who held his blade against his neck. Ready to keep going? Shino almost chuckled as he let out a sigh. I apologize, Kurenai-sensei. It seems I failed you as well. He turned his head towards Genma and nodded. I concede. He nodded and quickly raised his hand. Shino Aburame has forfeited the match. The winner is Sasuke Uchiha. It almost seemed like a bomb went off, as the crowd lit up in applause. Sasuke rolled his eyes as he calmly sheathed his sword. After wiping off the mud from his hands, he reached out and helped Shino to his feet. I hope I did not hurt your queen too much, he said, making sure Shino could steady himself. I see you did your homework before our match. She is fine. A little shaken, but she will easily recover. Thank you for keeping your word. Anytime, Sasuke nodded as the two shook hands. This is bullshit, Kiba fumed as he crossed his arms. Kiba. Kurenai glared at him. But sensei. He stole my move. How the hell did he learn that anyway? He growled, Akamaru barking in agreement. The Sharingan is a powerful tool, Kakashi replied tapping his headband. In case you didn't know already, it allows him to copy almost any jutsu he happens to see. While I agree he should have asked for your clan's permission first, he picked that up by watching your match with Niji in the preliminaries. That's so not fair. Kiba shouted, earning another glare from Kurenai. Honestly, at times it felt like he was just hanging out with his mom instead of his teacher. Life usually isn't, but now maybe you can see why everyone holds the Uchiha in such high regard, Kakashi replied gesturing at the cheering crowd. They were the backbone of our military and police for years. To the village, Sasuke is seen the last connection to that time. Kiba grumbled as he tightened his hoodie and sunk into his seat. It's still bull, he grumbled and sighed as he watched Sasuke and Shino go their separate ways. At least put it to good use, you proud jackass. Woo! Did you see that? That was amazing. Tai hollered along with the rest of the crowd. A smile a mile wide stretched across his face as he turned towards his sister. And you're friends with him. He's so cool. Ria was silent as she watched Sasuke make his way across the arena. Even at this distance, she could see him rolling his eyes at the crowd's praise. She chuckled at the pout on his face, and finally joined the crowd in their applause. Not too bad, she whispered. She was not alone in her sentiment. Barely 20 feet away from her, another person was thinking the exact same thing. Very good, Sasuke-kun, Orochimaru grinned as he watched the boy reunite with his team. He was thankful for the cloth hiding his mouth, for his sneer certainly would have raised some eyebrows from the guards. Impressive display, but let's see how well you fare against my son. On the far side of reserved seating, the Hyuga's elite sat huddled together, applauding with the rest of the crowd. You would have been proud, Mikoto, Hayashi internally sighed as he watched Sasuke banter back and forth with his team. While he reminisced in the memories of his fallen teammates, he failed to notice that he wasn't the only one in their booth staring at the Uchiha. Those eyes, they muttered under their breath. Keen on taking one last peek, they quickly activated their Byakugan and zoomed straight in at the boy in question. Their gaze never left his solid, black eyes, which were now forever burnt into their memory as red. She could not suppress a grin as her mind began racing with possibilities. Magnificent! Would Dosu and Gaara make their way to the field, please? Genma shouted as soon as the applause died out. I guess it's time, Dosu growled as he began making his way towards the exit. He caught sight of Naruto shooting him a dirty look, which only caused him to chuckle. Naruto narrowed his eyes. He still held some resentment from the Sound Team's ambush in the Forest of Death. Although they, or rather Sasuke, had sent them packing, they had caught him in a bad mood. To be honest, he half wished he were the one who got to face Dosu. He is weak. He is barely worth my time, a voice murmured behind him. Team 7 turned around to face Gaara staring them straight down. He glanced over their shoulders at Dosu, who was already on the field. He is not worthy, but you two, he said glancing back up at Naruto and Sasuke, are worth my time. Mother will savor your blood most. All three were stunned as the red-headed boy began to make his way towards the exit. Naruto was the first to recover and shook his head. Hey, just what the hell is that supposed to mean? He growled as he reached out and grabbed him by the shoulder. As soon as he touched him, Naruto visibly flinched as a loud roar echoed through his head. What the hell was dash? He was cut off from his thoughts as a massive amount of killing intent washed over him. Gaara slowly turned his head and glared at his with his bloodshot eyes. Remove your hand, or I will remove it from you. Naruto was too shocked to truly react. He was still confused by the sounds in his head, and the boy's sheer presence was making it hard for him to move. Naruto-kun, don't go starting a fight, Hinata quickly jumped in, pulling him back from the other boy. As soon as his hand left Gaara's shoulder, the fog of killing intent seemed to wash away. Gaara gave him one last glare, before making his way towards the steps. I honestly don't think it's possible for you to stay away from trouble, Sasuke remarked as he watched Gaara disappear down the stairwell. After not receiving a reply, he was surprised to see the blonde still slightly dazed. You alright? He asked, nudging him. Ha! Yeah, I'm fine, Naruto muttered as he watched Gaara emerge from the tunnel. Don't tell me he actually scared you. Naruto's response, or rather lack of one, truly surprised his teammates. No. It's not that. It's something else. What is it? Hinata asked. I'm not quite sure myself, Naruto muttered as his mind replayed the roar over and over again. He had heard that roar once before, and it did not settle his mind to hear it again. Something was wrong about that kid, and, whatever it was, it made the Kyuubi very unhappy. Chapter 48, The Finals, Part 4. Hysteric shrieks swept the crowd as blood splattered across the grass. Nei-chan! Tai cried as Ria clamped her hands over his eyes. Of course this would happen. This was exactly what she had been afraid of. I said that's enough. Genma shouted as he watched Dosu's arms contort more and more, to the point where bones were painfully sticking out of his skin. Gaara paid him no mind as he tightened the sand's grip on his opponent. Dosu was currently encompassed by a cocoon of sand, which was crushing the boy's body at an agonizingly slow pace. The boy's prized gauntlet was in pieces, as well as the rest of the arm it was attached to. The corners of Gaara's mouth tugged into a grin as he raised his arms and began clenching his fingers. You may not satisfy mother's thirst, but you will do for now, he droned as the sand encompassed the boy's whole body. Before he could finish his work, he froze as his view was suddenly blocked. Release him. Now, Genma ordered as he glared down at the boy. Gaara barely reacted as he turned to glare at the four, cloaked ANBU agents, who had surrounded him. After staring down the man for a few seconds, he relented. It didn't matter. He'd be dead soon anyway. As you wish. The sphere of sand fell to the ground, dropping Dosu along with it. It quickly retreated away from his bleeding body and returned to Gaara's gourd. As soon as Dosu reappeared, the medic team was on him in seconds, rushing him off the field. Gaara paid them no mind. They were of no importance. As he made his way back to the observation deck, he simply stared back at the two individuals who did interest him. I'd worry more about the Kazekage's son if I were you. Well, let's just say that he's not natural. I believe you two are locked on a collision course whether you like it or not. EHL's words were starting to make him more uncomfortable by the minute. On top of that, he couldn't get the echoes of the Kyuubi's roar out of his head. Just what was it that was upsetting the damn fox so much? Naruto stared back at the redhead's emotionless eyes, and immediately felt a new wave of uncertainty wash over him. While Gaara didn't say a word, his message to the two of them was obvious. You're next. Ria was silent as she felt her brother trembling in her arms. Are you okay, Tai? She asked, finally removing her hands from his face. I think so, he somberly muttered as he tried to stop shaking. She grit her teeth as she watched the proctor announce a short break. This was exactly why she didn't want to come. While her brother may have been too young to understand the morbid nature of the shinobi world, she wasn't. It was so easy to get caught up in the magic of all jutsu and fighting that you could forget that this wasn't just a game. Some of these people were here for blood. This was the reality of the shinobi life. Grab your stuff. We're leaving, she said as she rose from her seat. What? No! Tai exclaimed, clenching onto the handrails of his seat. Yes, we are. I refuse to let you continue watching this. But Ria! This is the first time you've ever let me see this. And it was probably the last. Now get up from your seat, Ria ordered. Make me, Tai replied back as gripped the arm rests even tighter. A pause of silence echoed between the two as they glared at each other, neither willing to back down. Are you going to make me drag you out of here? Ria coldly asked, placing a hand on her hip. No, we're both going to walk out of here once your friend has won this tournament, he replied with a fierce determination that honestly surprised her. Why does that matter to you? She asked. Because he's your friend. You may be strict and annoying, but you're my sister. That means you look after me, and I look out for you. Ria shook her head and pinched her nose. And what does that have to do with this? Tai grew quiet as he looked down. I get why you have to work all the time. You just want to take care of me, but you never look after yourself. You never go out to have fun, and you don't really have any friends. It's always just work, work, work. Ria felt her face growing hot as she began to notice people starting to lose their interest on the field and begin to stare at their argument. Oh, she did not need this right now, but you finally got a friend, and he's the one who invited us to come here. You're always lecturing me about manners and junk, so isn't the polite thing to do to stay and watch him until the end? She didn't know what made her angrier. That her brother had a fair point, or that she partly agreed with him. Honestly, she couldn't tell if he was just saying it so that he could stay, or that he meant it. Probably both. She rubbed her forehead to try ease the migraine she already could feel was coming. He could never just make things easy. She sighed and looked up at him. Fine. We'll stay. On one condition, she finished pausing the smile that had started to spread on his face. If I think, for any reason, that a match has gone too far and you are too young to see it, we are leaving. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Are we clear, Crystal? He replied with a salute, before patting at her seat for her to retake her spot. She sighed and slunk back into her seat, desperately trying to cast off the attention they had drawn from their little conversation. Immediately, guilt began to rack up inside her. Had she made the right decision? Had she given in too easily? Not for the first time, she reflected on how she was truly not ready for this. While she had tried her best to raise her little brother, she just didn't know if she was doing a good job. How do you even prepare for being thrust into the role of a parent? How could you ever be ready for that much responsibility? Thank you for your patience, Ginma called out after the giant red stain and pieces of bone had been washed from the field. Now, we shall continue. Hinata Hyuga and Jay Oshiro, make your way to the field. Come on, Miss Hyuga. Let's give the crowd a performance to lift their spirits. Jay winked as he made his way towards the steps. Good luck out there. Make sure to kick his ass just for me, Naruto smiled, giving her a thumbs up. You don't need luck. You're just fine without it. Make sure not to beat him up too bad, Sasuke said, giving her a thumbs up as well. She smiled and nodded before following Jay out to the grass. As they took their places across from one another, Hinata quietly settled into her Juken stance, while Jay simply stood with his hands in his pockets as if he didn't have a care in the world. Remember, when I say the match is over, it's over. I don't expect a problem from you two, but don't make me enforce that again, and try to liven up the mood if you can, Ginma whispered at the end, before addressing the crowd. Alright. Let the next match of the tournament begin. As soon as he waved his arm, Hinata activated her Byakugan. She grew tense as she waited for Jay to lunge at her, but he simply stood there as if he didn't have a care in the world. The crowd erupted in applause as the tournament finally started once again. However, even among the thousands of people present, one person managed to stand out more loudly than anyone else. Gu Hinata-chan. Kick his ass. Whoa, quite a fan club you've got over there, Jay chuckled, nodding his head in the blonde's direction. She fought to stop the faint blush across her cheeks from growing from his sweet, yet embarrassing behavior. He's very supportive. Oh, I'll bet. Then again, it's easy to understand when he has a teammate as lovely as you are, he replied with a coy smile. She chuckled as her blush began to vanish. Flattery will get you nowhere, Jay-san. I have no doubt. Unlike other girls, you are a true kunoichi. Such trivial things such as appearances or suitors do not distract you. You focus on your goals, and take your steps in stride to claim them. Thank you. Hinata hesitatingly replied. My pleasure, however, you are not without your faults, he responded. Hinata was caught off guard. Excuse me, Jay chuckled and began slightly strolling in a circle around her. Well, nobody's perfect. Everyone has his or her flaws. We all have scars, both physically and mentally. These scars in our psyche shape us into who we are. Her Byakugan flared as she watched him continue to talk. I'm pretty good at reading people. It's almost a necessity for my line of work. Now, do you want to know what I see underneath that proud kunoichi exterior of yours, Miss Hyuga? Hinata remained silent as she glared at the blonde boy as he stopped and turned to face her. "I see a disappointing, little girl who's too terrified to stand up to daddy." Silence fell upon the crowd as they anxiously awaited Hinata's response. Jay was slightly surprised as he saw a smile begin to form on her face. "I can see what you are up to, Jay-san. Your tricks will not work on me." "I have no idea what you're talking about," he coyly shrugged. "I saw your genjutsu the moment you started talking. Amplifying your chakra through your throat. Your whole speech is a genjutsu to try and provoke me into attacking, allowing you to control the pace of our battle with your genjutsu, presumably making me more and more frustrated as we go on. Gives a whole new meaning to sweet talking, doesn't it?" Jay chuckled in response. "Well, I didn't really expect that to work, but it was worth a shot," he shrugged. It was the exact same problem that Haruno girl had faced when she had fought his opponent's cousin. With those impeccable eyes, they could easily see the genjutsu being cast and easily dispel it. That was the trouble with fighting a Hyuga as a genjutsu user, however. Hinata was immediately on guard as Jay reached into his pouch and began withdrawing 3 metal cylinders. That didn't mean it was impossible. Hinata simply stared in confusion as he began to slide the pieces together. "Is that a flute?" Naruto finished as he and the rest of the crowd watched on perplexed, as the Kyomonin finished assembling the metal instrument. A devious smirk split apart his face, as Jay raised the instrument to his lips. "Let's put that Hyuga bloodline to the test, shall we?" As the light notes began to fill the massive coliseum, the entire crowd drew unnaturally silent in order to listen to the melancholic melody. It seemed to lull them into an almost trance-like state. The notes echoed off the curved walls of the arena, even causing those waiting in lines to stop in their tracks. Hinata remained alert as the melody drifted over her. She shook off the lulling feeling and remained rooted in her spot. For a while, she simply stood there, waiting to make a move. Constantly monitoring her chakra network and carefully watching his through her Byakugan. Yet, nothing was happening. He wasn't using any chakra at all. He was simply standing there, playing away as if he didn't have a care in the world. Uncomfortable with waiting for him to make the first move, she shot off and began rushing towards him. Despite her rapidly approaching him, Jay still remained motionless with his eyes closed. She was within 1 foot of him. Her arm was sweeping up, prepared to knock the flute from his hands, when suddenly his eyes shot open and his fingers flied across the pads, trilling a high note. Hinata's eyes shot wide open. She overloaded her feet with chakra and leapt away as hard as she could. "What happened?" Naruto asked as he and Sasuke watched in confusion, as Hinata landed from her rapid escape. Hinata trembled as a bead of sweat dropped down her forehead. She took several deep breaths in an attempt to calm down her heart, which felt like it was racing a mile a minute. She didn't know what had come over her. 1 second she had felt relaxed and confident. The next, panic. Sheer panic. What was that? The corner of Jay's lips curled up as he ceased his trill. He then closed his eyes and resumed his unsettling melody. Hinata clenched her hands as she wrestled her heartbeat back under control. Taking one last breath, she grit her teeth and raced towards him again. Reaching into her pouch, she palmed 3 smoke bombs and launched them at her opponent. Despite this, Jay seemed unbothered as he simply stood still as purple smoke erupted beside him. Hinata raced into the cloud and launched herself into the air. The hiss of the smoke bombs covered her approach as she landed behind him. Just as Kakashi had taught her, she quietly began stalking her opponent, creeping up behind him with measured steps. When she was within 5 feet, she paused. Crouching down, she began pumping her feet with chakra and prepared to attack him again. Just as she was about to spring off, Jay began trilling again, this time at a higher octave. Without thinking, Hinata twisted the weight of her feet and launched out of the smoke in the opposite direction. The audience gasped in surprise as they watched the Hyuga air retreat once again. This time she continued back away, further and further until she found herself with her back against the wall. As the smoke dissipated, Jay paused his song to turn and treat her with a smirk. Hinata had her hands on her knees as she panted. Her stomach felt like it was twisting into knots. "What are you doing to me?" she exclaimed. "Wouldn't you like to know?" he quietly taunted before launching into a new song. Hinata took 2 minutes to center herself before standing up. She remained silent as she carefully observed her opponent. She couldn't keep playing by his rules. He was just leading her around and making her look foolish. It was time to take back control of this fight. She raised her hands and began racing through several hand signs. Raising her hand to her mouth, she cried, "Suetun, water bullets!" Four blasts of water fired off across the arena. This time, Jay was forced to move as he leapt and dodged away from the masses of water. Hinata continued her assault and chased after him from a comfortable distance. She continued pushing him back until he found himself with his back against the wall. He leapt backwards to avoid the final bullet, before attaching himself to the wall. Hinata chased after him, already racing through new hand seals. Suetun, water needle barrage. The puddles along the ground from Hinata's water bullets began condensing together, firing off wave after wave of paper-thin needles up towards the wall. Jay raced along the curve as the needles peppered the wall in his wake. As Jay began dancing higher and higher up the arena, he looked down and noticed Hinata racing through more hand seals. Immediately, the water needles embedded in the wall stretched out and combined together into a thin tendril. His eyes widened as the whip-like appendage shot upward and grabbed hold of his ankle. His song was cut off as the tendril yanked him from the wall and threw him against the ground, knocking the wind from his lungs. His flute fell from his hands, rolling to the side. He winced as he opened his eyes, before rolling away as Hinata's foot smashed into the ground. He jumped to his feet to block the incoming blows. Jay grunted as she began pushing him back. It wasn't that he couldn't handle her. It was that it was so damn aggravating to have to focus more on dodging and slapping her strikes away due to her tedious tenketsu closing technique. His eyebrow rose as her fists ignited in blue flames and a set of fangs hovered over her palms. Even though he was blocking her strikes, he could literally feel his chakra being drained away. He grabbed her right strike and yanked her forward. He gave her a kick, causing her to slightly stumble as he dove for his flute. As she turned to strike his back, he whipped around with the instrument in his hands and quickly held out a low note. Hinata was immediately startled to see something dart behind her from the corner of her eye. Instinctively, she twisted around with a slash, but was stunned when she turned around. Nothing. Nothing was there. The world went black momentarily as a sharp pain erupted from the back of her skull. She stumbled slightly from the blow and received one more, before she could raise her arms to block another. She growled and pumped chakra into her forearm as she launched a strike straight at his neck. However, her palm was diverted from its intended path as he slid her arm with his flute into his shoulder instead. Wincing at the suddenly influx of chakra, Jay stumbled back. He raced through four hand signs and slammed his hand into the ground. Hinata was caught off balance as the ground beneath her catapulted her into the air away from him. Hinata stumbled on the landing, falling to one knee. She cradled her head as she felt blood running down her neck. She wasn't the only one cradling her wounds. Jay rubbed at the new bruise along his shoulder. She had missed his tenketsu, but it was still incredibly sore. He was surprised to look up and see Hinata's palms bathed in a green light as she cradled her head. Right. She's a mednin, he thought to himself with only mild irritation. It wasn't too big of a problem, but it could certainly make things complicated. Overall, it didn't really matter that much. After gauging her reactions from his first few tests, he had pretty good read on her. Time to get to work. Jay unbuttoned the pack along the back of his belt and ran his fingers along the four colored scrolls. He debated grabbing the red scroll, but settled on the yellow. It was only polite to make this a private affair. He could tell she was a sweet girl. There was no need to ruin her intimate relationships. Hinata let out a sigh as the bruise on her head began fading away. Even so, blood continued to trickle down her face from where he had hit her with his flute. She glared at her opponent and set her eyes on the small instrument. That thing was starting to annoy her. Her first step was removing it from the equation. She was immediately alert as Jay withdrew a scroll from his pouch and unrolled it on the ground. What are you afraid of, Miss Hyuga? Pardon? Her stomach clenched into knots as a more sinister look washed over his face as he smiled at her. What occupies your thoughts as you drift to sleep? A fear of disappointment? Rejection? Or how about something as simple as ghosts? Subconsciously, the burning image of horned figure flashed into her mind, causing her to flinch. Jay chuckled as he noticed the last one strike a nerve. Well, we'll see soon enough. Without warning, he twirled his flute into the air, like a baton. As the whole crowd was distracted, he raced through 12 hand signs and stomped on the scroll. Doton Entrapment, Symphony 7, Whispering Echo Chamber. Hinata leapt to the side as dark lines shot of the scroll and raced past her along the ground. They spread out, contorted into an intricate pattern stretching from one side of the arena to the other. Hinata was caught off guard as the ground began slowly rising around her. She glanced back in shock as a massive dome began encompassing a large portion of the arena. I cannot be trapped inside. She shot off and began racing over the rising walls towards the rapidly disappearing hole in the roof. She leapt off from the pillar of stone and twisted midair to run upside down on the dome. Jay caught his flute and rapidly began playing several notes. He aimed the end of the instrument at Hinata and fired off 2 bullets of air. The bullets blocked her path, sending her flying back. Quickly withdrawing a kunai, she slammed it into one of the stone pillars, and began sliding down the stone with a sinking heart as she watched the hole close up, blanketing the entire structure in darkness. She continued her descent and quietly landed on the ground. Even though her Byakugan allowed her to see through the darkness, it still left her unsettled. She could still see Jay. In fact, he had decided to sit down in the center of a room towards the center of the structure. The scroll responsible for this construction was sitting right in front of him. From her perspective, it simply radiated chakra, which seemed to feed directly into the earth. Taking a deep breath, she collected herself and began making her way towards the outer wall. After walking down a short alley, she reached the edge of the dome. She reached into her bag and quickly withdrew 3 explosive tags. After placing them against the wall and retreating a safe distance, she made a hand sign and activated them. The explosion echoed off the wall, sending debris flying everywhere. To her disappointment, she could only watch as the minimal damage she had inflicted was repaired. With her Byakugan, she could see a steady path of chakra leading from the scroll to the damaged section of the wall. She sighed as she leaned against a wall. Great! She couldn't bust her way out. She'd have to destroy the scroll first, and the only way to get to it was to traverse his stone maze. She was forced to play his game, whether she liked it or not. At least she could see through the walls with her Byakugan. With that one consolation in mind, she set out along the dark corridors. What's going on in there? What is he doing to her? The Sharingan can only see traces of chakra, idiot. I can't see through walls, Sasuke replied in irritation. Naruto grit his teeth as he turned towards Neji, who was observing the match through his Byakugan. Well, Neji remained silent for a few seconds, before dryly stating, it appears to be some sort of a maze. Hinata-sama is located about 30 degrees to your right on the opposite side of the arena. Her opponent is sitting within a structure about 20 feet into the air in the very center of the dome. Naruto was quiet as he gripped the rails. I don't get it. What's the point? He called it an echo chamber, correct? Shikamaru spoke up, settling in next to Naruto. My guess is that he's planning on amplifying the effects of whatever he's doing with that flute of his. But just what is that flute doing? Sasuke asked as they stared off at the stone structure. Kakashi was just as frustrated as his students. Not just because he was unable to watch his student, but also because he had been surprised at how well the boy had outmaneuvered Hinata from the start of the match, by barely moving a muscle. All she would do was draw close to him, and then immediately bolt off. He glanced across at the Kumo Jounin sitting 2 down from him. Care to explain what's going on? The man simply chuckled as a sly grin lit up his face. That boy is perhaps the cleverest person I've ever met. He turned towards Kurenai and asked, as the expert, why don't you bring the genin up to speed about musical genjutsu? The group turned to face Kurenai and she replied, musical genjutsu is the application of converting chakra into sound waves and affecting the target's mind through their auditory senses. Textbook definition if I've ever heard one. The Jounin chuckled, yes, musical genjutsu is just another method of spreading your chakra into a target to affect their chakra system. But that still doesn't explain why it'd work on a Hyuga. Kiba cut in, they could still see it with their Byakugan. Hinata even saw him do it earlier in the match. You're absolutely right. It wouldn't normally, which is why he found a way to circumvent that. He smiled and turned towards Kakashi with a coy smile. Do you believe in ghosts, Hataki-san? Not at all. Well, neither does Jay, but as a genjutsu user, he was intrigued about why we fear the supernatural so much. To better understand what causes fear in the human mind, he actually went out and camped in reportedly haunted locations. As you know, genjutsu is all about awareness in the subject. If he could find a way to emulate that atmosphere with his flute, he could push his opponent to react the way he wanted. A proud smile washed over his face as he sighed. That boy set out to determine what about those locations made people uneasy, and he made one hell of a discovery. At this point, he had truly piqued Kurenai's interest. What was it? She curiously asked. He discovered that at each of these locations, there was a faint sound wave that echoed throughout the area at a pitch too low for the human brain to recognize, usually caused by old pipes. He calls it infrasound. It's a whole bunch of technical mumbo-jumbo, but the gist is that while our ears can't pick it up, that doesn't mean the rest of our body doesn't react to it. It actually elicits fear in the body. The heart starts beating at an increased rate. Kakashi's eyes widened as it started to piece together. That explained Hinata's violent reaction when she got close. Not just that. It also plays nasty tricks on your eyes, causing them to vibrate. He believes that's why people believe to see ghosts at those locations. He leaned back in his chair as Kakashi reflected on Hinata's random reaction before she got hit in the head. Now mix that with chakra and you have a deadly recipe. He's not affecting her chakra network like regular genjutsu. He's attacking her through biology, and her brain is filling in the rest. Even with her Byakugan active, he can cause her to see illusions by forcing her body to panic. The worst part, the closer she gets to him, the worse it shall become. Kakashi was quiet as he processed this information. He and Guy shared a look before turning back towards the arena. Something didn't feel right. While the participants who had made it this far in the exam were expected to have a chunin skill level, this felt like more than that. The whole team from Kyumo was starting to unsettle him. Naruto's opponent had certainly been above chunin level and apparently so was Hinata's. He cast an eye down at the tan boy below him, whose leg was still bandaged in a cast. While he had failed to demonstrate his own abilities, from how his teammate described him, he was a tracking and summoning expert. What other tricks were they hiding? Kakashi glanced at the jounin. That's quite impressive of him to start his own research mission. Takes a lot of motivation. As if, EHL muttered beneath him. Ko and their jounin shared a chuckle at his response. Well, let's just say he wanted some time out of the house. His mother can be quite the slave driver. There is a reason he's so good at his music. Practice, practice, and more practice. He'd rather be out making googly eyes over girls, but his mother is very vocal that he should be focusing on his studies. Studying genjutsu is his way to escape from that, Ko informed them before turning to his teammate. EHL, did you see which color he chose? Yellow, he grunted. Okay, good, Ko sighed in relief, much to the other genin's confusion. What do you mean? Ino asked. You'll see, he chuckled, refusing to say anything more on the matter. All the group could do was sit there and wait until someone emerged from the structure. The jounin was silent as he thought about the match. Poor girl. She seemed like the nervous type. Jay was going to give her a heart attack. Even with her Byakugan, she was in for a rough ride. All he has to do is give her an outlet, and her brain will do the rest of the work. Despite the loud murmurs of the crowd outside, the dome was enveloped in almost utter silence. The only sounds were the melodic tones of Jay's flute bouncing off of the walls. Hinata was cautious around every turn, preparing for a trap. Even though she could see through the walls, she didn't want to take the chance. It was honestly starting to unsettle her. She had been walking around this ridiculous maze for 10 minutes, and she didn't seem to be making any headway. Every time, she seemed to grow closer to the center, the path seemed to deviate and lead her away. Not only that, but she could not shake off the uncomfortable feeling that she was being watched. Even though she could still see Jay sitting comfortably at the center, she couldn't help but feel as if a set of eyes of watching her. Every time the paranoia attempted to settle in, she would pause and take a deep breath. She didn't know what it was, but she was growing increasingly unsettled, and she didn't know why. Another thing was that her eyes were feeling funny. Her vision would occasionally grow fuzzy and they would water a little. All the while, she was already planning on what she was going to do when she reached her opponent. An explosive kunai would probably destroy the scroll, and disrupt whatever his flute's music was doing to her. She'd have to be careful though. If he knew she was coming, he could easily repeat whatever the hell he was. Her eyes widened, and she ducked back as a massive sword stabbed straight through the wall an inch above her face. She stumbled onto her back as the blade was yanked from the wall. She rolled to the side as stabbed again and again, more violently with each thrust. She retreated around the corner as watched the wall with shallow breath. She was having a hard time breathing. Her voice just seemed to be lost as she recognized the figure behind the wall, but it was just impossible. The massive sword carved through the wall again, creating two diagonal lines into an X. After a moment, the hulking figure smashed through the stone, sending dust everywhere. As the dust settled, she could only stare with her mouth open at the unmistakable silhouette in front of her. What? But, you're dead? I got over it, the figure growled as it tossed several kunai towards her. She ducked behind the wall, and ducked down as the massive Kubikarabocho hacked into the corner of the wall she was hiding behind. She stumbled to her feet and started jogging away as the figure lumbered into the alley, tugging its sword out of the stone. How? How could he be here? He died in wave, she desperately thought as the dark figure chased her down the halls. Panic was overriding her composure as the figure relentlessly hunted her down the dark corridors. You're going to pay for what you did to me. The voice echoed off the walls, followed by the clang of metal on stone as he slashed through the stone walls in his wake. I'm gonna hack you limb from limb, and once I'm done, I'm gonna dismember those other brats. After all of that, I'm going skin that bastard Kakashi. At Kakashi's name, her mind froze and she slowed down to a halt. She simply stood there, with her head pointing down. Her panic startled to settle as one singular thought echoed in her mind. It was impossible. Kakashi did kill him. Her eyes hardened and she turned around as the figure twisted around the corner. The demon of the mist's eyes seemed to glow red as he hunched over. Her eyes took in his dark form, and it was exactly as she remembered it. His spiky hair. Lanky arms. However, there was only one aspect she was concerned about. She stared down at his chest and glared back. No hole. He wasn't even wearing the outfit he had worn on the bridge. Instead, it was the shirtless outfit he had worn during their first encounter by the river. The same outfit he had worn when she had been exposed to his horrid killing intent. Her eyes narrowed as he slammed his sword against the ground and began dragging it behind him. He took 2 slow steps, before he shot off in a full-blown sprint. She took a deep breath as she slid into her Jukin form. His blade rocketed towards her at speeds surprising for a blade of its size, but she was ready. Blue chakra sparked to life, stretching out into a thin blade. With all her might, she parried the blow away, knocking both her and the figure back. Hinata was quick to recover and collided with the man once again. He reared back and prepared another swing, which she ducked under. She rolled past him, and as he turned around to swing, her other palm exploded with chakra. The chakra blade slashed out, cutting the massive sword in two, with surprising ease. Unfettered, she continued the motion and slashed out with her other hand, slicing across his face. The figure stumbled back, but barely reacted to the bow. It simply hung there before slowly turning to face her. The lanky man certainly seemed to live up to his demonic moniker. Just like she remembered, he had those awful shark-like teeth. The figure roared at her and began to charge. In one swift motion, she sliced upwards, dismembering the figure's arms from its body. As it let out a blood-curdling roar, she stabbed forward, straight into the man's mouth. It simply seemed to freeze there, as if unable to comprehend what had happened. With a grunt, she twisted her arm and yanked the beam of chakra out of its head. The silhouette crumpled to the floor as its legs gave out beneath it. Standing victorious over the figure, her eyes started going fuzzy and tear again. She rubbed them away with the back of her hand, and she froze once she looked down again at the figure. In the place of the demon of the mist was a mud-like caricature of a man, slowly dissolving into the ground. Mud clone, she whispered in relief as she took a few steps back and leaned against the wall. She let out a deep breath as she sunk onto the floor. For a few minutes, she simply sat there, letting her heartbeat die down. Despite the eerie quiet that had settled over the maze, her mind was racing in 100 different directions. The more analytical side of her was considering what exactly had just happened, the softer side of her was just relieved it was over, but the predominant thing echoing through her body was shame. She was supposed to be a kunoichi. Someone unfazable and steadfast in the heat of the moment. She had taken one look at him and simply panicked. Instead of facing the problem head-on, she had ran. Not because it was a tactical retreat, but because she was scared. Scared of something as silly as a ghost. Her eyes narrowed as she remembered Jay's taunt from earlier. What are you afraid of, Miss Hyuga? A fear of disappointment? Rejection? Or how about something as simple as ghosts? He had planned this. Had he trapped her in a genjutsu at some point? After sending a quick pulse through her system, she was relieved to find nothing had changed. If it wasn't that, then what? Her eyes narrowed as the melancholic music echoed through the dome. Whatever he was doing, it had to do with that flute. Whether he was somehow trapping her in a genjutsu without her knowing it or simply casting some jutsu she had never heard of before, it didn't matter. Her plan was the same. She pushed herself up and brushed her pants. After taking one last look at the pile of mud, she set back off through the maze. Jay slightly paused as he felt his connection disappear. Stage 1 is complete, he thought as he closed his eyes once again. He didn't expect the first mud clone to take her down. She was too far away from his music for her to be affected too much. At this distance, she'd only start to see the hallucinations, but, at the very least, it should have worn her down a little. Now that the physically stage was over, it was time to switch to a more emotional approach. Once again, Hinata winced as her eyes started to water, and angrily wiped away the tears. It was really starting to bug her. She didn't know what it was. On top of that, her vision kept going fuzzy and it growing discomforting. Perhaps she was simply allergic to something in the air. Even with her med-meme training, she wasn't exactly trained for. Hinata froze as the scream permeated throughout the maze. She pressed her back against the closest wall and slowly peeked around the corner. Seeing nothing, she frowned and glimpsed up at Jay, who still remained motionless. She felt her guy clench up as the whimpered scream erupted again. This time, however, her heart stopped as she recognized the voice. She slowly crept around the corner and began tiptoeing towards the next intersection, growing closer and closer to the painful sobs of something off to her left. Her hands shook as she gripped the wall and turned around the corner. At the end of the corridor sat a hunched figure, leaning against the wall. The figure was covered in blood and taking incredibly shallow breaths. Her heart caught in her throat as she spied the mob of blonde hair. The figure slowly reared up its head and weakly reached out to her. "Hinata-chan, please, help him." He was cut off as a hand shot out around the corner and dragged the boy into the darkness. Without a second thought, Hinata chased down the corridor after him. Her mind was on autopilot. As she shot around the corner, her breath caught in her lungs. Blank, glassy eyes stared up at her. The boy's hands lay limp across the ground, as a huddled figure sat beside him, ripping into his flesh. The creature froze and seemed to sniff the air, before turning its head in her direction. Hinata was paralyzed as the creature turned and she finally caught sight of its eyes. Each were bright red with two tomos spinning inside. The creature's arms lay hanging by its sides. Its arms and face covered in flaming black markings that only accented the crazed look in its eyes. Sasuke? A grin split apart its face as the boy simply shook his head. To her utter horror, his head began twisting around, far past the point where a human should be able to. It raised its hands towards the side of its head facing her. She took a step back as it parted its hair, revealing a yellow pair of eyes staring back at her. The pale face seemed to delight in her terror as she took a step back. "No," she gasped. "I told you before. Sasuke is mine, Hinata-chan. Now and forever. But don't worry. You're next," Orochimaru chuckled. Hinata could barely breathe, let alone move. She tried her hardest to turn around and run, but she simply couldn't do it. She wanted to do anything. Scream out in fear even, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The Sannin chuckled before hissing and launching towards her with his elongated neck. Instinct took over as her palms erupted to life. A uncomfortable squelching noise bounced off the walls followed by a dull thud as the creature's head dropped to the floor. Hinata remained rooted in her spot, with her arms still extended from her attack. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she forced herself to stop shaking. Slowly, she lowered her arm and clenched her hands together. "It's all an illusion. It's not real," she whispered in an attempt to reassure herself. As she opened eyes, she quickly felt her tears return as she stared at the mutilated bodies of her teammates. She couldn't help it. She knew it wasn't them, but that didn't mean it made the sight any less upsetting. It's not real. It's not real," she choked as she gazed down at the boys. "Oh, I wouldn't be too sure about that," a voice whispered behind her. Her blood froze as the sound of hissing began erupting behind her. She whipped around to see the severed head roll onto its side to stare at her. "Like I told you in the forest, I am not finished with you yet." The head chuckled before its neck began to wriggle and grow. The sound of wet flesh slapped against the ground as the head and neck of the Sannin began to work in tandem, acting just like the summons he so actively imitated. The serpent rose from the ground and turned to face her, revealing its massive fangs as chuckled at her distress. Hinata reacted as any creature did in the presence of a predator. "Run!" She twisted around and shot off down the corridor from whence she came, with the snake chasing her in hot pursuit. "It's not real. It's not real," she shouted to herself, just before the dodging to the side as it lunged at her feet. It missed its target, but as it grazed her skin, she reacted and kicked the face away. It shook its head before hissing and racing after her again. "Okay, maybe it is real, But it isn't him. However, no matter how many times she repeated this fact, no matter how much her brain knew it to be true, that face wouldn't disappear. She could still hear his taunting laughter as they raced throughout the maze. You failed them. You were too weak, it taunted as the creature easily dodged through the barrage of kunai Hinata tossed behind her. You have always been too weak for your clan, and now you are too weak to save your teammates. Shut up. Shut up. She shouted as she whipped around the corner to face a dead end. The snake slithered to a halt and began approaching her at a slower pace, taking its time to play with its prey. You will always be weak, and do you know why? You lacked what they did not, conviction. The Uchiha was fueled by his nightmares and thirst for vengeance. Even the Kyuubi brat held steadfast in his conviction to become the Hokage of this pitiful village. It paused as it began turning around the corner. They deserved their place in Team 7's legacy. What did you ever off? Orochimaru was cut off as blue light shot forward, piercing straight through his mouth. The creature widened its eyes and chalked on the chakra blade as Hinata lifted it into the air. You're right. I have been a failure. All my life, it's been one disappointment after another. I could never live up to my father's expectations, I was unable to protect Sasuke from you, and I was too cowardly to reach out to Naruto when he needed people most, she spoke somberly, before glaring and pulling the Sanin's face up to hers. But you know what? I am a proud failure. I make mistakes, but I also learn from them. And just like the two of them, I will never give up. Not now, not ever. She reared back and slammed the blade into the ground, watching the creature's tail wriggle in panic as it desperately tried to escape. Its eyes seemed to panic as her other palm ignited a chakra blade as well. And I certainly won't give up to a pathetic snake in the dirt, she cried out as she stabbed the snake with her other hand, before twisting both blades and slicing the creature into 4 pieces. She remained silent as she began to see the white skin of the tail begin to disappear, revealing the deteriorating body of another mud clone. As the illusion began to approach its face, one eye swiveled around and glanced at her. I will be back for you. Without another word, the multiple bodies of mud sunk into the ground without a sound. Jay opened his eyes as he began to hear footsteps approaching from down the hall. He continued to play as his opponent came to a stop at the entrance of his room. For a minute, they just stood there, staring back at each other. Jay finished the end of his minuet and finally lowered his flute. Welcome, Miss Hyuga. I must say, you don't seem too pleased to see me. Indeed she didn't. If her teammates had been there, they would have been shocked. It was very rare to see Hinata angry. She was an incredibly patient person with a deep sense of compassion. Seeing her frown at someone was just unheard of. But she wasn't angry. She was pissed. What you did to me, it was uncalled for. It's a competition, Jay shrugged. It was cruel. She exclaimed, her voice echoing off the walls of the room. Not my fault. You can blame yourself for what you saw, Jay calmly replied as he rose to his feet. What are you talking about? I don't know how you cast a genjutsu on me, but this is your illusion. Like any conductor, I simply guide the performance. The members of the orchestra are the ones who control how the music sounds. Jay paused as he tapped his head with the tip of his flute. I simply guided your body to respond to certain stimuli, such as being attacked or seeing someone you cared for getting hurt. Anything after that was all on you. My music simply influenced your mind to project your thoughts onto these situations. Any particular person that showed up or what they said all came from your own subconscious. Even I can't get that far into your mind while you have the Byakugan. Hinata remained silent, but continued to fix the boy with a fierce glare. What does your flute actually do? Well, you've made it this far, I might as well reward you, he replied as he began spinning his flute in his hand. To sum it all up, I play, you panic, and your mind does the rest. And your mud clones? Simply a blank canvas for you to project your fears. Due to the nature of my technique, I would have a hard time doing this out in the open, but in here, he remarked throwing his arms outward, the sound projects everywhere, amplifying its affects. The closer you got, the more violent the response. Jay stopped spinning his flute and his grin disappeared. And now, here we are. The climax. I will not be fooled by your clones anymore, she declared, striking into her Juken stance. I know you won't, he chuckled as he raised his flute to his mouth. At this distance, I won't even need them. Hinata took 3 steps before she froze in her tracks. She grit her teeth as Jay began playing a more frantic melody. She could literally feel her heartbeat rising and falling to the pace of the song. Still, even as her sight began to blur, she fought with as much self-control as she could muster and took a step. And then another step. And another. While it was at a snail's pace, she began making her way across the room. Her eyes locked with Jay's, sending an unspoken promise. This will not stop me. Jay seemed amused, and then proceeded to glance over her shoulder. She started to turn her head, but just as Quick forced it back forwards. No! She would not fall for his tricks again. Besides, part of her didn't want to know. Based on what her subconscious had subjected to her before now, she didn't want to know what she would see within this close proximity. As she gazed up into his eyes, she caught a glimpse of the reflection and froze. Jay was too far away to get a clear outline of what was behind her, but she didn't need it to identify what it was. The turquoise glow was more than enough. She fought from falling to her knees as it stepped out from the Byakugant's blind spot. It was just as she had remembered it, sharp, curved horns sticking from its forehead, a blinding, turquoise light pulsing from its body, and its eyes. Empty, white eyes that seemed to stare straight into her soul. In that moment, as she gazed into those eyes, she collapsed. Her knees gave out, and she fell onto her hands. Everything came rushing back. The panic she had felt that day in the library, and every nightmare that occurred afterwards. She simply sat on her knees, twitching, as her heartbeat began racing higher and higher. Jay blinked in surprise as he glanced at the empty space behind her. He had expected a strong reaction, but not quite this severe. From what he had learned of the girl's past, he had expected that she would have seen her father or, if she had any lingering regrets, her mother. This wasn't a response to either of those. If it was her father or mother, he would have expected her to break down crying and start apologizing, but this was absolute terror. What the hell had she been exposed to that he didn't know about? He needed to end this quickly. Her heart was beating too fast. If he didn't act, she could suffer a heart attack. With that in mind, he slowly began making his way across the room. Memories were racing through Hinata's mind one after the other. She was forced to relive every panic-induced nightmare that had sent her screaming awake. Through every horrid moment, he was there, simply standing there in the back. His dark silhouette taunting her every dream. In a blink, she was back in the body of her 10-year-old self. The figure towered over her as she huddled into a ball. Why? What do you want from me? She screamed in her mind, only to be met with dull silence. Why? Why me? What is it you want me to do? She cried, burying her face into her knees. Whatever it is, we'll find out together. She blinked in confusion and lifted her head to see two young boys standing in front of her. You don't have to be afraid. You're not alone anymore, the raven-haired one reassured her with a smirk. We've got your back. The blonde-haired boy lit up with a smile. You better believe it. It doesn't matter how long it takes, but we're with you all the way. We made a promise, and you know how I am about promises, he chuckled as they both reached out their hands. Hinata remained silent as she chuckled, wiping away a tear. After a pause of hesitation, she reached out and gripped their hands. You both are such idiots. Yeah, but we're your idiots. Jay slowed down the tempo as he finally stood in front of Hinata. Carefully trilling with one hand, he began reaching into his pouch for a kunai. One hit to the head and this would be over. His breath caught in his throat, bringing his song to a halt, as Hinata's eyes shot open and she nailed him in the stomach. Jay wretched as be stumbled away, giving Hinata enough time to rise to her feet. Impossible. No one overcomes their fear that fast. It's just not that simple. You can learn to control it, but that takes time and practice. A single tear rolled down Hinata's face before she looked up and glared at him. I don't know how you broke out, but no one overcomes their fears that fast, Jay growled as he began pumping more chakra into his throat. Hinata flinched as the shadow of the horned figure flickered back into existence, but she bit her lip and refused to let her knees give in again. She was no longer being forced to relive her memories, but she still could barely move. I don't care what kind of mental fortitude you have, but you can't control your biology. Your body will still react to my music. Jay thought as he watched Hinata struggle to stay on her feet. Hinata grit her teeth as she slowly forced her hand towards her pouch. Jay's eyes widened as he glimpsed the tag attached to her kunai, and before he could do anything, she simply tossed it into the air. The tag exploded, sending both parties flying backward. The music came to a screeching halt as the sounds of the explosion rebounded off the walls of the room. Jay groaned as he pushed himself off the ground. He had trouble breathing from the concussive wave of the explosion. As he peeked open an eye, he could see a green glow through the dust. She's healing herself, he cursed as he fought to get to his feet. He froze as the dust began to clear and she became completely visible. She was holding her side with her right hand, which was hard at work healing her bruises. Her other hand was pointed at the ground, with a blue blade of chakra erupting out of her palm. Before he could say anything, she stabbed down, right into the yellow scroll holding the mace together. It was quite anticlimactic at first, as the scroll simply ceased glowing and began to crumple up. Shortly thereafter, the ground heaved as chunks of stone began falling from the ceiling. Without the scroll, the structure can't support itself. It will keep trying to repair itself without a source of chakra to power it, he cursed as he grabbed his flute off the floor. Out of the corner of his eye, he spied the girl darting in his direction. He quickly raced through 4 hand seals and slammed his hand onto the dirt. The ground beneath him flipped over, rescuing him as Hinata's blade buried into the stone. The audience let out sheets of surprise as the stone structure began to crumble and collapse in on itself. What's going on? Naruto exclaimed, desperately holding on to the handrail as the ground shook beneath them. Over there. Sasuke pointed as a hand shot out from ground 30 feet from the dome. Jay let out a gasp for air as he yanked himself out from the ground. He didn't have much time to rest. The audience gasped as a blade of chakra penetrated out from the second story of the dome. It made a diagonal slice and another in the opposite direction, forming an X, before the wall simply exploded. Naruto let out a sigh of relief he didn't know he'd been holding as Hinata stepped into view. There didn't seem to be any serious injuries from the look of her. However, the longer he gazed at her, the more he realized something was wrong. In all the time he had spent with her, he had honestly never seen her that angry. A second later, she shot off towards Jay faster than Naruto had ever seen her move before. Before he could even lift his flute to his lips, she was on him. In a flash of blue, Jay was mildly shocked as his flute was sliced clean in half. She reared back with her right fist, and the chakra in her palm reared back and shifted into the shape of her lion fangs. Before Jay could respond, she smashed her fist into his face. As he reeled back, she ducked under his guard and slammed her palm right into his chest, directly above his lung. Jay violently heaved as he fell forwards. Before he could hit the ground, Hinata grabbed him by his hair and yanked him up with her blade hovering right in his face. All he could do was fight to breathe as her stared into her furious eyes. He considered reaching for his red scroll, but he decided to let it go. He still had a job to do. I give up, he wheezed, signaling for Gemma's attention. Jay Oshiro has forfeited the match. The winner is Hinata Hyuga. Happy to finally see some action again, the crowd went nuts for the Hyuga heiress. However, their cheers fell on deaf ears. She wasn't listening. She didn't care. Her eyes were still locked with his. Even after Gemma's announcement, she had barely moved a muscle, with her blade hovering a hair width away from Jay's throat. Hinata-sama. It is over. Let him go, Gemma called out. When she failed to respond, he walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. Hinata-sama. Let him go. Hinata held her a glare with Jay for several seconds before finally closing her eyes. She let out a deep breath as she let go of his hair and deactivated her jutsu. You alright? Gemma whispered as they watched a medical officer help lift Jay up to his feet. He got uneasy as she turned and began to walk away without a word. Congratulations, Jay coughed over the roar of the crowd. Hinata stopped in her tracks, but didn't turn around. It was your subconscious fighting against you, he panted as he turned to face the infirmary. Whatever you did to overcome them, stick to it. Learn something from this. Without another word, he and the officer began walking off the field. Way to go, Hinata-chan. You really showed that loud mouth who's boss. Naruto cheered as she finally arrived up the stairs. As she finally came into view, he paused. Something was wrong. He and Sasuke were immediately concerned as she walked up to the two of them with her head down. You okay? Sasuke asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. I will be, she quietly muttered. Hinata-chan. What happened? Naruto was cut off as she out and yanked the both of them into a hug. What's wrong? Naruto trailed off as he felt her trembling against him. Please. Just for a moment, she whispered, tightening her grip around their necks. They didn't need another word. They responded in kind, giving her all the support she needed. Chapter 49, The Paradox of Fate. Chuji was frantic as he tried his best to stop his food from spilling from his lap, as Ino violently kept shaking his arm in excitement. Come on, Shikamaru. Ino's voice screeched, her voice lost over the roar of the crowd. He bit the inside of his cheek as beads of sweat trickled down his forehead. His face was contorted in deep concentration on the thin, black line racing across the dirt field. As it twisted and curved in pursuit of the blonde-haired girl backpedaling away, he had to fight his instinctual urge to brush away the sweat gathering above his brow. The crowd was alive and on its feet. After simply waiting and watching the Stone Dome for the majority of the last match, they were excited to finally get things going again, and this match was certainly proving to be entertaining. "You can do better than that, Shikamaru," Naruto loudly hollered from the platform, earning a tiny glare from the Nara in question, before returning back to the matter at hand. Lazybones is actually doing pretty good for himself. "Don't you think, Hinata?" Naruto chuckled. His cheerful demeanor slightly faded when she simply nodded and kept staring down at the arena floor. He grew quiet as he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. He was really starting to grow worried, and he didn't really know what to do. Ever since she had returned from her match with Jay, she had barely said a word. After clamping Sasuke and himself into a firm hug, she refused to lighten her grip for a good 5 minutes before she finally settled down. Afterwards, she had simply murmured that she wasn't ready to talk about it and took her place along the balcony. Of course Sasuke wasn't much help. He glanced across Hinata and sent the boy a small glare, to which he simply shot him back a look that said, "Hey, you're better at this emotional thing than I am." So here he was. He just felt stuck, not knowing what to do as one of his best friends seemed to be in lockdown. He was about to speak when he noticed Neji making his way towards them. The pale-eyed boy simply ignored Naruto's glare as he casually took a spot next to him at ledge. He glanced past the irritated blonde at Hinata, who was still staring down, deep in thought. "Congratulations are in order, Hinata-sama," he spoke, stirring her from her daze. She glanced once in his direction, before mumbling a soft thank you, placing her hands along the railing. Despite that, "I cannot help but feel slightly disappointed," he slightly scolded, waiting for her reaction. "She won, didn't she?" Quite ferociously to boot, Sasuke defensively responded, sending him a slight glare from her other side. "Oh, I must agree. I've honestly never seen her quite that angry before." "I'm referring to the rest of her performance." Hinata sent him an odd look as he pushed off the railing and walked past her. He stopped alongside her, and without turning his head whispered, "I could see everything." Hinata felt her face grow hot as she realized Neji had seen her mild breakdowns inside of the maze. "And if I could see them," he trailed off. This time, she felt her heart drop, as a cold feeling spread across her chest. Naruto grew increasingly worried as she started shaking and her head whipped around towards the other side of the stadium. "That's right. Most of the clan, including the council, surely saw it as well," Neji finished. Her grip on the guardrail threatened to bend the thin metal frame. She felt her breath hitch as wave after wave of embarrassment and fear race across her body as the implications started settling in. "So what?" Naruto cut in, stepping between the cousins. "Whatever happened, she was under a form of genjutsu the Hyuga have never had to deal with before. They'll understand that." Neji chuckled as he cast his attention towards Naruto. "Then you really don't know much about the Hyuga Council, do you? The main branch is far too prideful to admit that any form of genjutsu would be able to surpass the Byakugan, especially one developed by a genin of all things." Sasuke clenched his teeth, as he knew the older boy was right. Neji glanced back at his cousin, who refused to meet his eyes as she continued to stare at the ground, shaking. "Even in victory, you're still fated to be a failure," Neji scoffed as he started to walk away, but was held in his tracks, as Naruto clenched onto the back of his collar. He felt himself twisted around to find Naruto directly in his face. "Care to repeat that again?" "Gladly." "The same could be said about you as well," Neji replied, staring straight back into Naruto's glare. As much as he wanted to see this play out, Sasuke reached out and grasped Naruto's hand on Neji's collar. "Naruto, don't do anything stupid. It's not worth getting disqualified for starting a fight now." Naruto growled as he stared back at Neji's relaxed eyes, whose gaze simply seemed to be begging him to take a swing. As he was about to open his mouth, an incredulous roar burst from the crowd, garnering their attention. Shouts and boos rained from the crowd as Shikamaru started walking away from the blonde-haired girl who stood frozen in place, absolutely shocked by what she had just heard. "What did he say?" Naruto asked in confusion. "He gave up," Kankuro chuckled from the other side of Sasuke as he watched his sister begin ranting at the Nara's retreating backside over her false win. "He what?" Naruto exclaimed, momentarily forgetting his quarrel with Neji as his eyes whipped around to follow Shikamaru as he made his way back. Naruto let the Hyuga go, as he joined in with the conclave of boos that showered down from the rest of the crowd. Niji simply dusted off his shirt as he flattened out the wrinkles in his collar. As the crowd continued to boo, the announcer came back out and tried to gain some control back over the stadium. "What the hell is wrong with you, Shikamaru?" Naruto exclaimed as the lazy Nara arrived from the stairwell. "What? Can't help it if I run out of chakra. What a drag too. I almost had her," he sighed as he rubbed the back of his neck. A tick mark grew on Naruto's forehead as he angrily tapped his foot. "Oh, of course you did. I bet she was running you ragged the entire time," Naruto huffed in exasperation. Shikamaru shot him an irritated glance. "Were you actually watching the match?" "Of course I was, until that stupid bastard starting bothering Hinata-chan. Speaking of which, Naruto." Sasuke cut in. "What? If you're really that riled up, now's your chance." "Huh?" Naruto asked, tilting his head in confusion. Sasuke rolled his eyes and simply pointed at the screen above the stadium, where Naruto's face was plastered alongside Niji's. "You're up," Sasuke said, glancing back at Niji as he calmly made his way towards the staircase. "About time," Naruto growled, cracking his knuckles. He was about to step away, when he felt a hand grab his shoulder. He looked back and was surprised to see Sasuke staring back at him with an expression he hadn't really seen on him before. "Kick his ass," Sasuke said with a glance at Hinata, who hadn't noticed their pair. Instead, she was watching her cousin make his way towards the center of the arena with a look of disappointment. Naruto gave him a small smile and nodded, gladly. "Meanwhile, now why did we have to watch from somewhere like this? Honestly, with all the money you make from those novels as you love to call them, surely you could have afforded somewhere better than this. Now, I'm sure Jiraiya-chan has his reasons. Besides, would you honestly rather be the center of attention as everyone stared at us?" An elderly man's voice responded. "That's not the point. He could have at least picked somewhere less windy," the elderly woman's voice responded. "All right. Settle down you two. It's main event time," Jiraiya smirked as he stared down from his spot on top of the arena. "So it is," Fukasaku replied as he turned his attention from poking fun at his wife to stare down at the arena below. He had been mildly surprised by Jiraiya's summons, especially for something as casual as watching some exams. Dropping her false irritation, Shima glanced up at Jiraiya. "While it's always lovely to spend time with you, Jiraiya-chan, something tells me you didn't call the two of us out here simply to watch your latest student. What's going on?" "Call it a hunch," Jiraiya replied as his eyes scanned the surrounding rooftops of the arena, before settling his gaze on the Kage press box. "A very unsettling hunch," Jiraiya finished, narrowing his eyes on the sitting form of the Kazekage as he conversed with the Hokage. "Expecting trouble?" Fukasaku asked. "Possibly. Let's just say I'd rather be safe than sorry about some sketch intel." "Well, we'll be happy to lend a hand if things go south, right Pa?" Fukasaku nodded as he turned his gaze down to the tiny speck of blonde hair, making his way towards the center of the field. "So this is the one Huli has been telling me about," he mused as he watched the boy get into position across from his opponent. "Just what troubles are you bringing us, Naruto Uzumaki?" Jiraiya was wrestling with his own thoughts as he stared down at his student. For better or worse, today was the day everything changed. "Naruto, come here for a minute," Jiraiya called, motioning the boy. He groaned but willingly jogged over to the old man, and patiently waited for what he had to say. "What's up, sensei?" Naruto asked after an odd period of silence. "I'm about to make a call, but I haven't really decided if it's the right one yet." "Ha! What do you mean?" he asked, cocking his head to the side. Jiraiya chuckled as he ruffled the boy's hair. He was just too pure. "You know what, we'll talk about it later, but for right now just remember this." Jiraiya was quiet as he watched Genma approaching the two boys. "I want you to go out there and announce to the world, I am here." Genma could feel the tension in the air between the two, as he got ready to start the match. "Alright, don't take things too far you two," he warned, giving them each a hard glare. "Alright, if you're both ready, then you can begin." Neither opponent moved, ignoring the crowd roaring in excitement. They simply stayed rooted in place, staring the other down. Niji smirked before asking, "You have something to wish to say before we get started?" "Yeah, as a matter of fact I do," Naruto replied with a glare. He paused for a few seconds before responding, "I've been waiting for this. Not just for what you did in the forest, but also for how you've been acting towards my team. I do not appreciate how you've acted towards Sasuke or myself." He paused as he glanced at the girl in question, whose full attention was now firmly fixed on the two of them, and especially towards Hinata. Hinata felt her face feel flushed as she felt him stare back and forth between Niji and herself. I may not be the smartest guy in the world, but don't think I haven't noticed your effect on her, and not just from today. Any time you're brought up, it immediately places her on edge. I may not know the full story, but I do not take people bothering my team lightly. I don't care if you are her cousin, I do not tolerate bullies. Niji seemed unaffected by his words as he began to settle into his opening stance. The words of a child. I think it's about time I showed you how pointless your little dream is, by reminding you of your place here and now. Likewise, Naruto responded as he also settled into his own stance. Silence swept over the arena as the whole crowd waited with bated breath for someone to make the first move. Niji was silent as he gazed at this opponent, tensing up at the slightest movement. Naruto smirked as he watched the frown on Niji's face. He suddenly jolted his body, causing Niji to jerk in alarm, prepared for the boy's oncoming assault. Instead, he grew frustrated as the blonde simply faked him out and continued to stay in place. A smile crept along Naruto's face at the boy's reaction, before he burst out laughing. Not letting his guard down, Niji remained frozen, watching the boy calm down to a chuckle. You know, Niji, as much as it really pains me to admit it, we actually have a lot in common. Really? Niji replied, raising an eyebrow in amused disbelief. Sure, Naruto replied shrugging, both of our fighting styles are actually pretty similar. All it can take is one touch and, poof, game over. All you got to do is touch me and shut down my chakra system, and I just got to tap you to place a gravity seal. However, he smirked as chakra began swirling in his gut, racing throughout his body and causing Niji to tense up in alarm. There is one critical difference in our styles. Niji narrowed his eyes. And what's that? Long range, Naruto smirked as he leapt backwards 2 times, before biting his thumb. He smeared the blood across the palm and raced through several hand signs before shouting, summoning Jutsu. Smoke erupted from the ground, obscuring the boy, causing the crowd to murmur in excitement. As the clouds faded away, their murmurs turned to confusion as they stared at the tiny orange and blue toad sitting between the boy's legs. What the hell is that? Ino asked in slight disgust, as they stared down at the strange creature squatting in front of Naruto. A frog? A toad, Asuma corrected in mild astonishment as he leaned forward in his seat. It had been years since he had seen any of the summons from Mount Myaboku. I didn't know anyone else besides Jiraiya of the Sannin had access to the toad contract, Ko responded in shock. As a summoning expert himself, he fully understood the rarity of seeing the summons of the Toad clan in person. Today's the day, huh boss? Gamakichi asked as he glanced around the arena, taking in the sights and sounds of the new environment. You bet. You ready to go? Gamakichi nodded agreement as his gaze finally settled on the Hyuga boy across from him. Wait. Are we fighting Mr. Pretty Boy over there? Honestly, how you built him up, I was expecting more, he shrugged as he gazed Niji up and down. Niji ignored their ridiculous banter as he carefully eyed the tiny creature. It had cost Uzumaki quite a lot of chakra for him to pump out this creature. While he would call him one any day of the week, Uzumaki was admittedly no fool when it came to combat. His battles involving Lee and the Cloud Nin had certainly demonstrated that. He kept up his guard as the tiny toad plopped onto the boy's head. Well, certainly seems like a festive occasion, Gamakichi commented glancing around the arena, it's really working up my appetite. We really should cook something. Hungry for barbecue? Starving, Naruto smirked as he glanced down at Niji. I'll bring the matches. And I'll bring the oil. Gamakichi finished as the two of them began racing through hand signs. Collaboration, Katan, Toad Oil Flame Bullet. The two cried in unison, as the oil launched from Gamakichi's mouth was ignited by Naruto's fire. The resulting fire roared to life, rushing across the field. Niji leapt backwards, vaulting hand over foot, and launched himself up the wall of the arena. The burning oil slammed against the concrete, pooling below him, causing him to face intense heat of the updraft. Gamakichi and Naruto leaned their heads back as they launched another volley of the burning oil. Niji quickly began racing along the wall, as the burning oil crashed in his tracks. He glared as he reached into his pouch and launched a barrage of shuriken at the immobile blonde. The blonde simply reached into his pouch and tossed a single kunai up in the air. Gamakichi's tongue burst from his mouth, wrapping around the tiny hole in the handle. In one fluid motion, his tongue whipped around, knocking the shuriken from their intended baths, much to the audience's excitement. Niji grunted as he leapt from the wall, and fell to the ground with some mild discomfort. Ignoring the feeling in his knees, he pushed himself up and began racing towards the pair. He dodged as short volleys of burning oil were launched at him, before the pair began running through new forms of hand signs. Suiton, pressure stream. Gamma kick shouted as water erupted from his mouth. The stream of water struck Niji in the shoulder, slightly veering him off course, but he was able to recover as he leapt and bent over the blast of water, as he grew increasingly closer. Pretty boy's got some fancy footwork, Gamakichi thought in irritation. Niji leapt up into the air, soaring over the duo's heads, causing Gamakichi to cut off his jutsu. Niji landed behind them, and swiftly slid into a low kick, sweeping Naruto off his feet. Niji continued his momentum and twisted around, his arms poised to thrust. As his body turned to face the falling boy, Niji's palm flew forward, aimed for the boy's shoulder. As he was about to land the first blow, something slimy and wet firmly wrapped around his arm and forcefully tugged him off balance. Niji followed the appendage wrapped around his wrist, and glared up at the toad that had finally left his perch from Naruto's head. Should be paying more attention, Niji, a voice taunted below him, causing his eyes to widen as he glanced down at the blonde below, who had his own arm outstretched, inches away from his bare skin. The blonde's devious smile was in full force as he reached up and tapped Niji's outstretched arm, causing a black pattern to burst to life on his skin. Gamakichi reared his head back and yanked the Hyuga boy off to the side, allowing Naruto to leap up off his back. Niji pulled as hard as he could against the small creature, but he was shocked by the amount of strength the tiny toad seemed to hide in its body. Fine, he cursed to himself as he quit fighting against the creature. He wrapped his arm around more of the creature's tongue and grabbed hold of it with his other. Squeezing down as hard as he could, he began forcing as much chakra as he could into the tongue's muscles. Gamakichi released him instantly, squealing in pain as his tongue began to painfully constrict. Niji made 3 steps towards the creature, before he suddenly found it incredibly hard to move. He grit his teeth as he fought simply to remain on his feet. He tried to glance behind him, before a fist was smashed into his face. Niji reeled back as Naruto smashed him once in the mouth. Fighting against weight pressing on him, he thrust his arm out, only for Naruto to duck under it. As Niji's arm sailed over his head, Naruto crossed his right hand into a seal. Niji's eyes widened as he felt the weight on him increase, making it even harder to stay upright. He tried to turn to defend himself, but was surprised to find something wet smack against his face. He gasped as he glanced down to see Tiny Toad delivering a kick to his stomach. In any other situation, Naruto would have laughed. It was almost comical to watch Gamakichi fighting so earnestly with his tongue uncomfortably sticking out of his mouth, but this wasn't the time for that. The two of them took turns darting in and out, taking shots at the Hyuga genius, as he struggled to put up any resistance through the gravity seal. The crowd was honestly shocked as they basically watched the village pariah mop the floor with the prodigy of the Hyuga clan. They were not the only ones. Hinata and Sasuke were just as surprised as they were. Hinata had constantly lived her life watching Niji's back as a looming presence that she'd never overcome. To see Naruto dealing with him so easily was incredible. Sasuke was surprised to see this much efficiency out of the blonde idiot. His fighting style had improved a lot. Of course, he was fighting against an opponent who couldn't fight back, but he could still see the improvements in his form. It was also in his eyes. The way they tracked Niji's movements. They just held more experience than the last time he watched him fight. Sasuke had a hard time suppressing a smile. Sure, he had to admit he was enjoying Niji face some karma, but the itch that had been born from watching Naruto's fight with EHL was back in full effect. He needed to know how they stacked up. Niji panted as he glared across at the two figures, patiently waiting for their next move. Before he could even make a step, Naruto rushed forward, sliding under his guard and sweeping his legs out from under him. As he fell backwards, his eyes widened as the tiny toad launched itself straight at him and smashed him with both legs, sending him flying. He groaned as he slid against the ground, until he came to an uncomfortable stop. Just as he had thought, the gravity seals were making it almost impossible to move. Having fun yet, Niji? "'Cause we can end this now if you want," the blonde taunted with a thick smile on his face. "As fun as wailing on you is, I don't think kicking the Hyuga prodigy while he's down will look good on my resume when I'm applying for Hokage." Niji couldn't help but chuckle, as he forced himself to face Naruto out of the corner of his eye. "Still clinging on to that ridiculous dream of yours? What of it? Ha, it's funny that you actually think that somehow you'll become the Hokage. The spot held for the greatest shinobi in the village will not be taken up by some random orphan everyone looks down on." Naruto was silent as he took a deep breath. He raised his hand in a sign, and Niji buckled as the gravity seals increased to an incredibly uncomfortable degree. He grunted as the ground beneath him actually cracked from the weight. Against Lee, Naruto had been sure to slowly increment the amount of gravitational force that affected his body in order to prevent the boy from seriously hurting himself. He saw no reason to continue that courtesy now. "Yeah, we're done," Naruto replied as he glanced over at the judge, who was slowly making his way across the arena. As soon as Naruto turned his attention away, Niji closed his eyes and began focusing his chakra into his head. "Honestly, I'm a little disappointed," Gamakichi croaked as he hopped next to Naruto's side. Naruto started to turn and say, "No kidding. Nice work by the W." Naruto was cut off as he suddenly felt a surge of chakra violently explode behind him. He whipped around only to see a fist 2 inches from his face. His eyes could only widen in surprise as he was sent flying back across the arena. "What the heck?" Gamakichi cried before he was violently kicked into the air. He felt his breath knocked from his body as he tumbled across the ground. The tiny toad was only to squeeze his eyes open to see a shining figure dart towards him, before his body exploded in pain once again. A fist firmly buried in his gut, smacking him to the ground. Before he could get up, Gamakichi felt himself being squeezed as he was lifted up. Naruto shook his head as he tried to clear his blurry vision. He had actually flown across the entire arena before smashing into the concrete wall. He placed a hand against the wall to steady himself as he glanced across the meadow. "I'm sorry I seem to disappoint the two of you, but I do hope that this makes up for it," the figure proclaimed before slamming the toad one last time against the ground, where he exploded into a pile of smoke. Naruto's eyes widened as he watched Gamakichi get dispelled back to empty Maiboku. While he certainly felt guilty for the toad, he had a feeling that Gamabunta's anger about the state of his son was the least of his problems right now. Niji's Byakugan seemed to be twice as intimidating as he stared his opponent down. Niji let out a long breath as he continued to feel his body adjust to this state. "Inner gates, gate of opening complete," he coldly stated. "Oh shit." Naruto thought as flashbacks of Lee started dancing in his mind. "I am not going to be a human beach ball again." In the stands, Lee watched on in frustration as he was forced to watch Niji utilizing the same technique that he had worked so hard to achieve. "Go ahead, Lee." "I know you have something to say," Guy said, as if reading his mind. "Sensei, you taught him the inner gates as well?" "Indeed. As much as it may hurt seeing Niji using that technique, you need to remember that he is also my pupil, and I cannot turn my students away when they ask for help." Tenten glanced back at him in surprise. "Niji actually asked you to teach him that?" "It surprised me as well," Guy replied, crossing his arms. "As you both know, Niji can be quite stubborn about opening up, so you can imagine my surprise when he approached me asking for help. After the preliminaries, he wanted me to teach him the basics of the technique." As much as he hates to admit it, Niji understood how challenging young Naruto would be as an opponent. He glanced down at Lee with a light smile. "You'll be proud to hear that he even admitted that he would not have been able to keep up with you if he had faced you in the preliminaries." Lee's eyes widened as Guy continued, so he understood the danger those gravity seals presented, and he needed a way to continue to fight unencumbered, if Naruto was able to get past his guard. "Just as you did, he saw the inner gates as a method to overcome the weight limit." "I see," Lee responded, gazing back down at his rival. Guy watched his young protege watch on, but decided to remain silent. This was not the place for this kind of talk. "And next," Niji cried out as he focused even more chakra in his brain. "Inner gates, gate of healing. Open." Naruto covered his eyes as the swell of chakra caused the wind to whip in his face. Niji slightly struggled to contain the overwhelming energy, as it traveled through every cell in his body. He had never felt so alert. With the limit removed from his brain, his mind was racing over 4 times its normal rate, allowing him to process information faster than ever before. His chakra began working throughout his body, repairing any damage that had been caused by Uzumaki's earlier assault. After a few seconds, he let out a sigh in comfort. He honestly felt incredible. The gravity seal left on his arm barely even registered to him anymore. It hardly even. "Activate." Niji's eyes widened as he felt the seal's force increase yet again. It wasn't nearly as bad as it was before, but he certainly could still feel it was there. Naruto was beyond shocked. Niji was currently pushing 5 times normal gravity and still on his feet. The current seal he had placed on him was at its max. He would have to apply more if he wanted to slow him down again. Without wasting any more time, Naruto raced towards the Hyuga, adjusting to the latest change in gravity. Naruto leapt through the air, aiming a kick at the boy's head, which he was easily able to block. Naruto leapt back before attempting 2 more strikes, which were met with the same level of ease. Tired of just waiting for his opponent, Neji finally began striking back. Naruto found himself truly struggling with Neji's blows. They weren't too fast for him to follow, but now they were about even regarding speed. It was now all up to whose taijutsu form was stronger, and unfortunately he knew between the two of them who had the other beat. "You know, Uzumaki, you were right earlier," Neji calmly stated after his latest barrage of attacks left a trail of purple welts along Naruto's forearm. He winced as he felt the Juken do its work, causing his muscles to painfully contract. "How so?" He grunted as he tried to knock away the seemingly faster strikes. "We do have similar styles, however, what sets us apart are our weaknesses." Naruto felt confused before hissing in pain as Neji got a surprise jab into his ribs. "I must thank you for pointing out my weakness in long range. I will be sure to remedy that. Your weakness, however, will not be so easily rectified." Neji then proceeded to land one punch to his face, before leaping over him. Sensing the momentary weakness on Neji's landing, Naruto whipped around as fast as he could to deliver a strike while he was vulnerable. Fist extended, he whipped around only for his heart to stop as he came face to face with someone else. Her eyes began to water, as he realized his fist was only inches from her face. His breath hitched in his chest as Neji lunged through the vision of Hinata to strike a Juken strike straight to the boy's lung. Naruto's eyes widened as blood erupted from his throat. "You're too sentimental," Neji commented as he began lowering himself into a very familiar stance. "Checkmate, Uzumaki," he declared as his fingers began glowing blue. 2 palms. He cried out as Naruto could do nothing to stop his fingers from jabbing into his skin. 4 palms. 8 palms. Sasuke and Hinata could only watch in frustration as Naruto was violently bombarded by more and more hits every second. Finally, Neji reared back for his final set. 8 trigrams, 64 palms. A fountain of blue erupted across Naruto's body as Neji's fingers danced across his skin, shutting down every single chakra point they came in contact with. With a final shout, he slammed his hand into Naruto's chest, sending him sliding back a foot and a half. The boy heaved as he tried to breathe and stay on his feet, before eventually, his legs gave out beneath him. Neji was heaving himself as he rested on his knees. Performing each of the movements of the 64 palm techniques while being weighed down by the gravity seals was no easy task. However, he chuckled as he regained his breath and made his way towards his opponent. "I must say, Uzumaki, I am quite impressed. I might have to take back what I said. You're not a complete failure after all. At least not as much as she is." Shut up." Naruto growled as he forced his head to look up at Neji. He grit his teeth as he glared up at Neji, his smug grin only pissing him off more. Growling. "What is your problem? I'm used to people hating me, but why are you so cruel to her? She's done nothing to you." Neji's eyes flashed as he glared down at the blonde. "Nothing to me," he repeated, "everything their fault. Both her and the rest of the main branch." "What the hell are you talking about?" Naruto gasped between breaths. Neji glanced towards the genin stands, and watched as Hinata shied away under his gaze. "It seems you're behind on your Hyuga history. Allow me to fill in the blanks that Hinata-sama failed to fill in." Naruto watched on in confusion as Neji removed his headband and silently began unwrapping the binds around his head. As he finished removing the final layer, Naruto was surprised to see the black marks adorning his forehead. While he didn't know exactly what it was, his brain was dissecting it almost by instinct. "Is that a seal?" he panted, unable to help his curiosity. "The caged bird seal," Neji angrily responded, lightly tracing over the design with a finger. Hinata watched on in guilty silence, unaware of the tiny light emitting from her pouch as a white symbol etched itself into a scroll. He angrily glared across the stadium towards the VIP box towards one man in particular. On the outside, Hayashi Hyuga met his nephew's glare with the same detached look he gave everyone. On the inside, he sighed, as he knew what was coming. Neji glared back at Naruto before angrily pointing at the seal. "This is a mark of suppression. Something forced onto all of the branch members at birth in order to keep us in line. Simply because of the order in which we are born, any member of the Hyuga may be forced to wear this for the rest of their lives." Naruto frowned as he saw Neji's muscles tense before he continued, "It's quite impressive in its cruelty. Would you like to know what it does?" Imagine I were to disobey an order from one of the clan's elders, or perhaps a main branch member didn't approve of my tone when speaking to them. Regardless if it's deserved or not, any one of them can activate this seal, and you can take my word that no matter how much you might believe you're in now. He glanced over Naruto's disheveled form before closing his eyes and continuing, would be blissful relief compared to what it does to you. For once, Naruto had nothing to say, as Niji glared up at the Kage box. It must be nice for the rest of the village to act oblivious and pretend that they don't allow this slavery to exist within their village's walls. As he ended his rant, Niji glanced back down at Naruto's troubled expression. He saw him glance over towards Hinata as asking her to verify if his story was true. Her refusal to meet his gaze told him everything he needed to know. She failed to mention that little detail, didn't she? That half of her clan was forced to live as slaves. Naruto was shaken from his stupor and grit his teeth as he glared back up at Niji. Fine. That really sucks. But what does that have to do with Hinata? True fury engulfed Niji's face, as he shouted, "She's the reason my father is dead." As Niji recounted the story of the Hyuga affair, even Sasuke felt no small amount of pity for Niji. It all started to click to him, as he remembered his first conversation with Hinata regarding Niji just before they entered the Forest of Death. Glancing down at her, he was surprised what he saw. The way she held herself was completely different than what he expected. She did not shudder or shake. In fact, he was surprised by how relaxed her body posture was. There was no violent outburst of guilt or sadness. Instead, it was all in her eyes. Her large, lavender eyes expressed more than her actions ever could. They were almost glossed over, etched with guilt, pity, and misery. All the while, 2 constant streams of tears trailed down her cheeks. He was silent for a few moments before whispering, "You know that isn't your fault, right?" She simply shook her head, her gaze never leaving Niji's face, contorted in anger and pain. Yes it is," she murmured as her tears began to puddle at the bottom of her cheek. Sasuke fell silent, before a frown settled onto his face. "So you're telling me at 3 years old, you somehow intentionally planned to be kidnapped by Kumo?" The question completely caught her off guard, causing her to break her stare from Niji. She turned to face Sasuke, who seemed to be ignoring her gaze. What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said. You said it was your fault. So you're telling me that somehow you were able to arrange someone to kidnap you at 3 years old? I don't understand. I'm not going to repeat myself. Did you or did you not?" He replied more sternly this time, casting an eye on her. "Oh, of course not," she responded, taken aback by his tone. He let out a breath from nose, before turning his gaze back to the field. "Then stop saying it's your fault. Stop burdening yourself with guilt for something you didn't commit. I can understand it is upsetting, but I don't want to hear you keep blaming yourself for things outside of your control. Are we clear?" Hinata remained silent as his words reverberated inside her mind. "Are we clear?" Sasuke repeated slightly louder, with a hint of irritation. She remained silent for a few more seconds before she lightly chuckled. She couldn't help but suppress the tugging on the edges of her lips, as the tiniest of smiles lit up her face as she realized what he was trying to do. She nodded as she finally began wiping away the trail of tears that had been gathering on her cheeks and under her chin. For the record, she slowly said as she rubbed her face against her sleeve, "You're going to need a deeper voice if you're going to try acting like sensei." Sasuke seemed to ignore her last comment as if he hadn't heard it, as he continued staring down at Naruto's beaten form. "Alright, pity time is over. Start paying attention. This match isn't over yet." Hinata was silent as she returned her attention back to the match at hand. She felt horrible as she gazed upon Naruto. His new clothes were torn and tattered, as well as stained from blood and dirt. She could feel Naruto's gaze as he turned his attention back to her. She didn't want things to end here for him, especially after all of his hard work. Finally, she shook herself as he broke her gaze, and turned back to respond to Sasuke. "What do you mean? Did you see that he has a plan?" "No, he has nothing, but this match still isn't over," Sasuke responded with certainty. Shimuro raised an eyebrow as the pair's conversation came to an end, and he took a place next to Sasuke at the railing. "Why do you say that?" Shikamaru asked, glancing up at him. "Because it's him. That idiot just doesn't know when to stay down," Sasuke replied with a light smirk. Shikamaru was silent for a second, before lightly chuckling and turning back to the field. Hinata also giggled at his remark as she turned back to the match. Sasuke was right. It was one of the many things she absolutely admired him for. His one creed that she had taken to heart more than any other. The will to never give up. Half a minute earlier, Niji was silent as he finished his story regarding the passing of his father. This is my fate now. To forever be a slave to an unworthy family. Forced to be held back, simply because my father came out a few seconds after hers. Naruto remained silent as he lay in the dirt. His body was aching and it was difficult to even breathe, but regardless of that, his brain was running a mile a minute, fully digesting Niji's story. He winced as he turned his head to glance across the arena towards the balcony, until his eyes fell on Hinata. It was obvious how guilty she felt. His gaze softened as he mind flashed back to the first time their team had ever met as a group. Of course she had been shy and nervous, but she calmly stood up and said, hello. My name is Hinata Hyuga. My likes also include reading, as well as flower pressing, and my family. My dislikes. Her thoughts trailed off as she thought about the divide in amongst the Hyuga. Are rather personal to my clan. And my dreams are. She blushes as she shoots Naruto a quick glance, before pinching herself and holding her head up high, to become the next leader of my clan, so that I can finally unify both houses. As his memory needed, he couldn't help but weakly smile as he watched Sasuke try to cheer her up in his own way, before shifting his gaze back to Niji. You're so full of shit, he muttered, making sure Niji would clearly hear him. Niji's eyes flashed in irritation as he lifted his foot and began firmly applying pressure to Naruto's back. Come again. Naruto only chuckled under Niji's display of force. For someone with X-ray, binocular, and 360 degrees of vision, it's amazing how blind you are. Naruto pushed his head up and shouted, she cares about you all so much. All she wants to do is help you, but you just put her down and belittle her. Are you sure she's the one suppressing you? Niji's nostrils flared as he applied slightly more pressure, before swiftly lifting his heel from Naruto's back and backed up. He turned to walk away, but turned one last time to say, placing my trust in her would be pointless. She is far too soft to run the clan. Besides, it's not as if she has any chance, especially after today. Her behavior inside the maze was pathetic, and it was observed by the entire council. Trust me, it did nothing to help her perception in the elders' eyes. She'll never have the support to become clan head. Well, it can be kinda hard to gain any traction when even your family keeps putting you down, Naruto shot in, causing Niji to pause. After a few seconds, he shook his head and turned to Ginma. Referee, this match is finished. I'm done wasting my time here. Without another word, Niji began making his way across the arena. Before he was even halfway back towards the stands, he paused as he heard a slight whistling sound. Instinct kicked in, and his head jerked to the side. A kunai sailed past his face, lightly cutting his cheek. He whipped around with a frown to see the blonde barely on his feet with one hand on his knees and the other outstretched in front of him. Where do you think you're going? Naruto panted. I'm not finished with you yet. He grit his teeth as Head raised his head to meet Niji's gaze. I am still standing. A fact that can be easily remedied, Niji responded in kind, before rushing back and forcefully shoving Naruto off his feet. Naruto slid a few feet before painfully falling backwards onto his back, where he spent the next minute gathering his breath, before he worked up enough energy to push himself to his feet. I'll give him this, he doesn't know when to give up, Niji thought as he watched Naruto teeter side to side, trying to stay on his feet. This is pointless. What do you hope to accomplish? You can't even access any chakra. Why do you keep getting back up? Naruto was silent before he slowly raised his hands into a single hand sign. Because, you called us, failures. He closed his eyes as he forced his body to begin tugging towards the mark along the middle of his stomach. He gritted his teeth as he pushed his body to reach out and clamp onto the swirling body of chakra, as a loud roar echoed in his mind. Suddenly, Niji found himself fighting to keep his balance as a wave of violent chakra flooded, accompanied with strong winds, swept over the stadium. What? What the hell is this? He thought incredulously. He winced as he fought to cover his eyes from the strong winds, but even with his Byakugan, he was still confused at what was going on. He was left shocked as he watched a strange, new source of chakra, drowned in a red, malevolent aura, begin flooding throughout the blonde's body. His entire chakra system should have been blocked off, but Naruto was somehow forcing this ridiculous chakra through his body's network. Not only was it flowing, but this chakra was also forcing open all of the blonde's chakra points he had closed off in his earlier attack. What is this dark chakra? Niji cursed as he could only watch as this strange, red chakra erupted from the boy's stomach, spreading out in every direction. Or, is it even chakra at all? There it is again, Hinata muttered as she and Sasuke braced themselves as the waves of heavy chakra washed over them. She had been only half conscious at the time, but she could still vividly remember the feeling this chakra from their mission to wave. While the chakra still held a malevolent feeling to it, it felt incredibly more reined in than before. However, that didn't mean it was something to scoff at. It still made the hair on her arms stand on end, and fill the air with a thick, heavy feeling that seemed to press down on her. She was forced to remove her grip on the railing to cover her eyes, as her face was assaulted by the onslaught of wind. Sasuke on the other hand didn't even seem to mind the wind. In fact, his eyes never left the sight of his teammate as this red chakra swirled around him. Sure, he had known about the blonde's tenant ever since the team's little heart in wave, but believing and seeing were two very different things. This was the first time he was actually conscious to experience the demon's chakra in person. He was shocked by just how overbearing it was. It felt like heavy bursts of hot gas were being blasted against his body, and that was without even mentioning its biggest effect, the rage. It was as if a presence was simply rolling through him in waves. The closest thing he could compare it to was Zabuza's killing intent, but even that paled in comparison. Zabuza's intent had been overbearing, but it had carried an almost manufactured feeling to it. It was almost like he could tell that the rage and anger weren't directly intended for him. But this, it almost felt personal. As if he were the true target of all of this presence's anger. All that hatred and anguish directed straight at him. But what really struck him the most was from whom all this was coming from. While he had accepted his teammate's status as a Jinchuriki, it was almost as if it never truly settled into his mind. The guy was just too naive and upbeat. The idea of the village's ultimate demon inside of him of all people just never clicked with him. But now, being bathed in the glow of this chakra, Sasuke felt like he was truly beginning to understand the situation his teammate was actually in. His eyes flashed red as the picture of Naruto's engulfed by a sea of red was burned into his mind. Even as the chakra continued to flow over him, it couldn't stop a new feeling that was rushing over him. Anticipation. Naruto was uncharacteristically silent as the strange chakra finally stopped thrashing out and spreading in every direction. As he let out his breath, the chakra seemed to settle and began focusing solely on his body, forming an aura around himself. When he finally opened his eyes, Niji was taken back by the sight. Gone were his bright, blue eyes. In their place, were two bloodshot, red eyes with sharp, slanted irises. He never broke Niji's gaze, as he calmly withdrew a trident-style kunai from his pouch. Impossible. Does he have a Kekai Genkai? Niji thought as he tried to understand what exactly was happening. What is he? Shaking himself from his stupor, Niji grit his teeth and began raising his own chakra. As he forced his energy to flow through his body, he could not stop Naruto's words from before echoing in his head. Well, it can be kinda hard to gain any traction when even your family keeps putting you down. Shut up. Shut up. Why? Why won't you just stay down? He growled as he took a few slow steps before racing full tilt towards the blonde. His hands erupted in blue chakra as he prepared to deliver another stroke, this time to his heart. Why? Naruto repeated before he too rushed forward. As they finally drew upon each other, the blonde tossed his kunai forward towards Niji's head. He almost smirked at the throw as he easily tilted his head to miss the blade. It was almost as if he wasn't even aiming for his head. Just as they were within inches of each other, the blonde indignantly cried, because that is my fate. Ignoring the blonde's words, Niji swept under his arm and pressed forward towards his chest. The blonde seemed completely unconcerned about the glaring weaknesses in his guard as Niji reached forward to strike him. And then, just as he was about to land his hit, it happened. He vanished. He simply vanished. Gone in a yellow flash. Dumbstruck, Niji could do nothing but continue his path forward before the blonde suddenly returned to his Byakugan's field of view, hovering right above his back. Niji was beyond shocked, but what actually scared him was the massive concentration of chakra that was forming in Naruto's hand. The heat from the Rasengan bathed his palm as he glared down at the wide-open back of his opponent. He tightened his grip on his kunai as he twisted mid-air and slammed the blue orb into the small of Niji's back. It was only a matter of seconds, but to everyone in the crowd, it felt like hours. All of the older shinobi recognized the technique instantly. Every single one of them mouthed the words that screamed from the boy's lips. Rasengan. Dust was sent flying as Niji was slammed into the earth beneath him. Niji's face stung with tears as his back erupted in pain from a combination of burning and tearing flesh. Any attempt to let out a cry of pain was cut back, as he was shot towards the ground, knocking the wind from his chest. The collision of the impact shattered the ground beneath him, launching up a cloud of dust into the air. A loud-sounding crack echoed off the walls of the arena, filling the silent void left by the stunned crowd. Naruto bit back the bile in his throat. The pain in his gut was sharp, but short-lived as he already felt the Kyuubi's chakra patching up the hole even faster than normal. He was silent as he stood over Niji's body, inspecting the spiral-shaped scar now etched into his back. The silence hung over them for a few more seconds, before he finally tore his gaze away from his back and met Niji's eyes. He simply stared back at those white eyes that were so similar to his teammates. Finally, Naruto spoke. Maybe there is some fate or destiny set out for us to follow, but what gives anyone the right to say that they know what their fate is? No one can see what the future holds, so just accepting something as fate is the same as giving up. Niji didn't know what to say as Naruto turned away from him. Sure, there are things in life we can't control. Things that we wish were different. Circumstances outside of our control. Naruto fell silent as he unconsciously placed a hand on the seal on his stomach. Moments of silence ticked by before he met Niji's gaze again. Niji was surprised to see the blonde's eyes full of even firmer resolve. But more than anything else, I believe it's our decisions, not the conditions of our lives, that determine our destiny. That's it for part 12. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.